She boarded the plane like any other passenger. Calm, professional, with a first-class ticket in hand. But minutes later, the seat she rightfully paid for became a battleground. And the woman sitting in it, she was escorted off the flight without warning, without cause, and with every camera on that plane recording her silent dignity. Who was this woman the airline dared to humiliate? Why did the incident spark outrage from Silicon Valley to Washington? D.C. And what secret power did she hold that would not only shake the company, but freeze $5 billion in funding overnight? What began as a routine flight turned into a national reckoning. A story not just about race, power, or injustice, but about one woman's quiet strength, her refusal to be erased, and the legacy she built from a single moment of violation. So what really happened at 37,000 feet? And how did she turn public shame into a revolution in the skies? This is not just a story. It is a movement. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe dignity should never require permission. Now, let's begin. The plane hadn't even left the gate when the whispers began. From row 1C, a woman in a silk blazer clutched her Chanel tote a little closer. Across the aisle, a man in a Rolex checked his boarding pass again, glancing up, then quickly away. The cabin of Silverline Flight 417 buzzed softly with polite conversation, clinking glasses, and the occasional rustle of designer luggage settling into overhead bins. And in the middle of all that quiet luxury, she sat, seat 2A, window seat, first class. She hadn't said much since boarding. She offered a gentle thank you to the gate agent and nodded politely to the flight attendant who offered her a welcome drink. Her carry-on was worn, canvas with faded seams and a frayed zipper pull. Her coat, though pressed, was simple, earth-toned, unremarkable. She placed her phone face down on the tray table and folded her hands on her lap. Her expression was unreadable, calm, still. Her name was Dr. Celeste Vaughn. To the casual eye, she might have seemed out of place, but she wasn't. She belonged exactly where she was. Still, the discomfort around her was impossible to ignore. Amber Collings, the lead flight attendant, had paused for just half a second longer than she should have when she saw the name on the manifest. Her perfectly glossed smile faltered, barely perceptible to the average passenger. But to someone like Celeste, someone trained to read people for a living, it was loud. Amber didn't greet her. She simply nodded and walked past. Celeste noticed. Of course, she did. She noticed the sideways glance from the man across the aisle as she buckled her seatbelt. She noticed how no one made eye contact. She noticed the subtle shift in energy the moment she sat down. She knew what they were thinking. She always knew. But she had learned long ago that reacting to suspicion with anger only confirmed their biases. So she sat, composed, poised, quiet, outside. The late afternoon light painted the tarmac gold as ground crew finished final checks. The jet bridge began to pull away. Celeste closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines vibrate through her chest. It grounded her. She had boarded dozens of flights like this in her life. But each time, there was always that moment. The moment when someone in the cabin wondered, silently or not so silently, if she was supposed to be there. And every time, she refused to shrink. The announcement chime rang. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Silverline Flight 417, nonstop service to Phoenix, Arizona. Please ensure all electronic devices are set to airplane mode. Celeste opened her eyes and stared forward. She didn't need the announcement. She'd memorized these scripts over years of business travel. She had built her career flying in and out of cities where boardrooms smelled of mahogany and unspoken rules. And yet here she was, still being questioned by the air in the room itself. She reached into her coat pocket and lightly touched the edge of the sealed envelope inside. It was thick, crisp, and stamped with Strataverse Capital's crimson emblem. Confidential Audit, Level 3. She would not use it today. Not unless she had to. She hoped she wouldn't. Next to her, the man in 2B gave a short cough and shifted away slightly, pulling out a folded Wall Street Journal. He didn't say hello. He hadn't even glanced at her when she arrived. Celeste didn't mind. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to observe. Across the aisle, Amber poured champagne into crystal flutes for rows 1A and 1B. Her movements were fluid, rehearsed. She laughed softly with the couple in matching cashmere. She leaned in, hands delicately clasped, voice warm and inviting. She hadn't yet made her way to Celeste's row. That was fine. Celeste wasn't thirsty. What she needed, what she was watching for, was consistency, kindness, professionalism. She could have flown in private comfort. Of course. Her firm owned 3 jets. But Strataverse's internal audit process was never about showing up as a power figure. It was about revealing truth. And truth only emerges when people believe you're no one important. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft taxied to the runway. Celeste turned toward the window and let her gaze soften. Her reflection stared back faintly in the glass-high cheekbones, dark almond eyes, a calm mouth that rarely trembled. She looked tired. Maybe she was. She'd spent the past 2 years rebuilding lives after quietly leaving a senior partner role in New York. Now, she led investment reviews with a specific purpose, not just to chase growth, but to hold systems accountable. She had seen too many institutions collapse from rot disguised as protocol. Silverline Air was next on her list. On paper, the airline was weeks from insolvency. A $5 billion emergency rescue from Strataverse was in final negotiation. Celeste had the authority to stop it with a single recommendation. She wasn't looking to destroy anyone, but she would not fund discrimination either. She pressed her fingers lightly to her temple and inhaled. Then a soft voice broke through. "Doctor." Von Celeste looked up. It was a young flight attendant. Nervous? Not Amber. "Would you mind confirming your seat number again? I just need to double-check something." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Celeste didn't move for a moment. Her eyes locked on his. Then she slowly reached for her boarding pass. It was right there, tucked into the side pocket of her bag. She handed it over. He scanned it, blinked. "Oh, thank you. That's all. Sorry about that." He hurried off without another word. Celeste stared at the empty space where he'd been, and smiled, very faintly. It had begun. The plane had taken off 20 minutes earlier. "Doctor." Celeste Vaughn sat with her arms resting lightly on the armrests, her back straight but relaxed. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, steady and low. The seatbelt sign had just turned off with a soft chime, but she remained still. She was thinking. Not of the headlines she'd read that morning or the market trends Strataverse Capital was watching. Not even of the $5 billion decision sitting quietly behind her eyes. She was thinking about the boy, the young flight attendant, Jared. He couldn't have been older than 25, polite, but clearly uncomfortable. The way he'd approached her earlier, asking to see her seat again, wasn't about protocol. It was about doubt, about fear of making a mistake, or fear of her. Celeste had seen it before. She'd lived it. That quiet tremble in the hands of someone forced to choose between professionalism and unspoken bias. Jared wasn't malicious. He was unsure, caught in the tension between what he'd been told and what he saw. And what he saw, perhaps, did not match the narrative his mind had prepared. She breathed in slowly through her nose, then out. She turned her gaze forward, across the aisle. Amber was making her way back down the cabin, tray in hand, collecting empty glasses. Her heels clicked softly on the plush carpet. Her movements were poised, almost theatrical, like someone raised in a world that rewarded elegance over empathy. Amber stopped at row 1C, where the woman with the Chanel tote smiled up at her like they were old friends. A soft laugh, a whispered compliment about the earrings. Amber smiled warmly and leaned in to respond. Then, without so much as a glance toward row 2, she pivoted and continued forward. Celeste watched the performance. It was subtle, but calculated. She had been deliberately skipped. Again. A lesser part of her wanted to speak up, but she quieted it. There would be time. And right now, what she needed most was not confrontation. It was clarity. She reached for her laptop, not to work. She had opened that screen 1,000 times, and right now it would only distract her. Instead, she clicked it open and let the reflection show her face. Still composed, still unreadable. The plane tilted slightly. Clouds drifted past the window like layers of gauze. Celeste watched them melt and reform, an endless cycle of disintegration and rebirth. It reminded her of something her grandmother once said. Dignity is not what you carry. It is what you refuse to drop. She smiled at the thought. That old woman, who cleaned homes for decades in Charleston, would have laughed if she saw her granddaughter now, sitting in first class, briefcase tucked beneath her seat, a sealed audit report bearing the power to bring $1 billion empire to its knees. Yet that same grandmother would have also seen through the performance around her. She would have named it for what it was. Quiet contempt. Not loud, not shouted, just practiced. Celeste leaned her head against the seat for a moment. The man beside her in 2B still had not spoken. He had shifted slightly, his body angled away from her, as though a few inches of distance could shield him from discomfort. She wondered what story he'd assigned to her. Was she a guest of someone more important? Someone who'd snuck into the wrong seat? Or, perhaps, a mistake? Her mind wandered further. How many times had this happened, just like this, in rooms where she was the keynote but mistaken for the assistant? How many times had she entered with credentials in her hand and still been asked to wait? She had stopped counting years ago, but what never changed was the weight of being the only one, the only black woman in the room, the only person whose presence had to be justified by her resume, the only body that triggered silence when it entered a space meant to be comfortable. She shook off the thought gently. This wasn't about her ego. It never was. Celeste had made peace with her uniqueness a long time ago. What unsettled her wasn't the stares or the silence. It was how quickly people decided what kind of story they were looking at based solely on the cover. Jared passed by again, moving toward the galley. He caught her eye briefly and hesitated. Celeste offered him a small nod. He blinked, unsure, then continued walking. There was no need to force the moment. Some people weren't ready to meet themselves yet, and that was fine. She was here to observe, not to fix. Another chime. Amber's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our lunch service shortly. Please take a moment to review the menu located in the seatback pocket in front of you. A rustle followed as menus were lifted. Celeste opened hers slowly. Simple choices: grilled chicken, pasta primavera, roasted salmon. She wasn't hungry. She closed the menu and set it aside. Amber appeared 2 minutes later, moving down the aisle once again. She stopped at row 1 and took the couple's orders with visible warmth. then row 1B. Then she looked up. Her eyes landed on Celeste. Flat. Cold. She turned to the man in 2B. Sir, would you like the salmon or the chicken today? She asked brightly. Celeste blinked. The man didn't hesitate. Salmon, he said, without glancing at Celeste. Amber jotted something down and turned. She never asked Celeste, never looked her way again. She moved on to row 3 as if 2A was invisible. Celeste's jaw tightened, just slightly. There it was. The test. This was not ignorance. This was not oversight. This was exclusion, purposeful, practiced, polished. She sat back slowly, closed her eyes for a moment. The tray table vibrated slightly from turbulence, or maybe just the tremble in her fingertips. No, not yet. Don't react. Observe. She opened her eyes again and reached down to her bag. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope once more. Still sealed. Still waiting. She pulled out a slim notepad instead and began to write. Service inconsistencies between passengers. Targeted seat re-verification request. Withheld beverage and meal offer. She paused, wrote a final line. Intentional omission. First documented bias escalation. She underlined it twice, then closed the notebook. A storm was coming, and she knew how to read the clouds. The cart rattled softly as it made its way down the aisle, pushed slowly by Amber's manicured hands. The clink of utensils and soft whispers of choice chicken or salmon punctuated the dull hum of the engines. For most passengers, it was just another flight. For Dr. Celeste Vaughn, it was becoming something else entirely. She was not a stranger to discomfort. She had spent her life excelling in spaces that were never designed for her. But what made this moment feel different was how carefully orchestrated the erasure had become. Not loud, not brash. Just the kind of exclusion that made you question your own eyes. Amber hadn't looked her way once since boarding. Not during the drink service. Not when handing out hot towels. Not even now, during meal service, when she asked every single person around Celeste what they preferred for lunch, skipping her without hesitation, like she didn't exist. It would have been easier if Amber had said something rude, raised her voice, made a scene. But this wasn't about words. It was about the absence of them. Celeste remained composed, her fingers gently resting on the notepad in her lap. She had already noted each omission, each passive act of dismissal. She was documenting with the precision of a surgeon, but inside her chest, something was stirring. It was not rage, not sadness. It was something more dangerous. Resolve. She looked toward the window for a moment. Clouds rolled gently beneath them. The sun cast golden streaks across the wing. It was peaceful out there. She thought briefly about her grandmother again. How that woman used to hum while folding laundry, whispering old hymns from memory. Not because anyone was listening, but because dignity, to her, was about presence. Celeste straightened in her seat. She was still present. She would remain so. As Amber moved further down the cabin, Celeste caught the sound of her laugh. It was directed at a young man in business class who had made some kind of joke. The kind of laugh that said, "I am comfortable here. I am at ease." Celeste envied none of it. What she did wonder, though, was how someone could move through the world so effortlessly blind to themselves. Across the aisle, a teenage girl with earbuds in looked over, her brows knitting slightly as if she sensed something was wrong. Her glance lingered for only a second. Then she returned to scrolling on her phone. The world keeps moving, Celeste thought, whether it sees you or not. The seatbelt light flickered on again. A voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." There was a shuffling, a few beeps as phones were silenced, and the steady click of seatbelts snapping shut. Celeste adjusted hers gently, the fabric cool against her waist. As the plane began to tremble slightly, she focused on her breath. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. It was a practice she had learned in therapy years ago, not because she was fragile, but because strength needs maintenance too. Her therapist had once said, "You don't owe the world your silence, just your steadiness." She had held on to that. Suddenly, a soft knock came from behind her seat, then a voice. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Celeste turned. It was Jared. He stood in the aisle, awkward but clearly trying. "I wanted to apologize." "About earlier," he said. His voice was quiet, but sincere. "I was told there was a discrepancy with your seat, and I followed protocol, but I realize now it didn't feel right." Celeste studied him. His cheeks were flushed. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his blazer. He was trying. "You followed instructions," she replied evenly. "But not all instructions are just—" Jared nodded, ashamed. "I know. I should have trusted what I saw. You had your ticket. You were seated. I'm sorry." There was a pause. The tremor in the aircraft deepened slightly, just enough to cause Jared to grasp the top of the seat in front of him. "You're young," Celeste said softly. "You still think doing the right thing will be easy." Jared swallowed. "I'll do better. I promise." Celeste looked at him for a moment longer, then gave him a slight nod. "Good. You'll have plenty of chances." Jared looked relieved. He nodded, gave her a small smile, and walked back toward the galley. She turned back in her seat. The tension in her shoulders had not faded. An apology was not justice, but it was a start. And more importantly, it reminded her that even in broken systems, there were still people willing to learn. She reached again for her notepad and added a new line beneath her earlier notes. Individual remorse acknowledged. Systemic behavior unchanged. The plane rocked harder for a moment, then steadied, and then, suddenly, it happened. A woman in row 3 rose abruptly, mid-air, mid-service. She looked flustered, her eyes wide. "I'm sorry, but I just saw something," she said aloud. Her voice was clear, urgent. "The woman in 2A, she never got her meal." Celeste's eyes widened. She turned slightly. The woman had red hair pulled into a ponytail and wore a simple green blouse. She looked like someone's kindergarten teacher. "I was watching," the woman continued. "You offered everyone else lunch. You skipped her. That's not right." Amber froze. She was 2 rows back, midway through handing someone a bread roll. Her entire posture stiffened. "Ma'am?" "I'll address that now," Amber said, her voice tight. "No." The woman interrupted. "It's not about food. It's about how you skipped her like she wasn't there." All eyes turned forward. The cabin had gone silent except for the engines. Celeste felt her heart pound once, but her face remained still. Amber looked flustered now. There was a misunderstanding. "No," said the woman in green. "There wasn't. I saw you." Then she sat back down, flushed but firm. Celeste exhaled slowly. The air around her buzzed with attention now. She felt the heat of everyone's gaze, the sudden recognition, the slow unraveling of polite indifference. Amber approached, her voice rehearsed. "Dr. Vaughn, I deeply apologize for the oversight. May I offer you the salmon or chicken?" Celeste looked up at her, looked her fully in the face. "No," she said softly. "You may not." Amber stood frozen for a moment, lips parted. Then Celeste added, "It's too late for lunch." And with that, She returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the clouds had thinned. The sun hit her face. It was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. Something had shifted. Not everything, but enough. The envelope sat quietly on Celeste Vaughn's lap, its ivory surface untouched, pristine, yet holding more weight than anything she had carried on board. It had no markings, no logo, just her name in handwritten script, sharp, precise. The kind of handwriting that spoke of someone who was raised to believe that their words mattered and would be read. She had tucked it into her briefcase when she boarded, not because she planned to open it mid-flight, but because part of her could not stand the idea of it being far from her. She had received it just hours before the flight hand-delivered by her legal advisor in a manila folder marked confidential. The board's vote had gone through. Unanimous. 12 voices. 12 names. She had been named chair of the Equitrust Investigative Council. Effective immediately. Celeste Vaughn. Black woman. Former ethics auditor. Systemic reformer. And now, the lead architect of how federal aviation would answer to decades of buried misconduct. She had sat with that news for exactly 13 minutes before her car arrived. And now, cruising 35,000 feet above a stitched patchwork of land and cloud, she found herself wondering not about the power she now wielded, but about the woman 2 rows behind her. The woman in the green blouse. The one who had spoken up, who had broken the silence. Her name, Celeste later learned from the manifest, was Joanne Lively, a public school teacher from Milwaukee, traveling for a conference on trauma-informed care. Of course she was. That explained everything. Teachers, Celeste thought, often saw what others chose not to. That one act had caused the air in the plane to change. Amber, the flight attendant, had gone unusually quiet. Service slowed. People watched her every movement now, uncertain whether to offer support or shrink back into their phones. And Celeste, for the first time since takeoff, felt like the silence wasn't hers to carry alone. The pilot's voice returned over the speaker, calm and professional. Folks, we're cruising at a smooth altitude. We'll have about 2 hours before we begin our descent into Phoenix. Should be a calm ride the rest of the way. But the turbulence Celeste felt now was internal. Her fingers brushed the envelope again. There was power inside it. But there was also something else. A responsibility she never asked for, and yet could never decline. She had spent years investigating misconduct in private equity circles. But this was different. This was federal, public, visible. The kind of scrutiny that brought not just backlash, but danger. This appointment would put her at the center of every hidden file, every ignored whistleblower, every flight log that never made the audit, and she would welcome it. Still, as she sat there, her thumb tracing the edge of the envelope, she felt the familiar push and pull of something deeper. Am I the right one for this? What if I become just another face they parade when it's convenient? What if I fail? The questions were quiet, not loud enough to shake her calm, but strong enough to whisper doubt into the corners of her confidence. She closed her eyes, listened to the soft drone of the engines, then remembered something. Years ago, she had interviewed a former airline safety coordinator, an older black man named Daryl. He had been fired quietly after raising concerns about discriminatory hiring in pilot training. When she asked him how he managed to speak up anyway, he said this: "When you know a thing is broken and you've got the tools to fix it, silence becomes a kind of betrayal." Celeste opened her eyes. She had the tools, the skills, the seat, and now, the stage. What she did next could not be about fear. She slipped the envelope open. Inside was the formal confirmation letter, embossed seal, legal sign-offs. But more than that, There was something else, a smaller sheet of stationery, a handwritten note. It was from Justice Eileen Marks, the outgoing chairwoman. Dear Celeste, you already know what this work requires, but I want you to remember what it deserves. It deserves eyes that stay open, even when it hurts to look. It deserves a voice that speaks up, even when others stay seated. And it deserves someone like you, who understands that dignity and fire can live in the same body. You will face resistance, not the obvious kind, the kind that smiles and delays, that dilutes, that suggests you wait. Don't wait. They picked you because you've never needed permission to do what's right. Lead well, with respect. Eileen Celeste's chest tightened as she read. Her eyes prickled with heat. It wasn't often that someone told her she didn't need to ask for permission. That single paragraph reminded her she never had. She folded the note carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then she reached for her tablet, scrolled through her notes, began updating the incident log from this flight. She titled it, Case 2147, Silver Line Flight 4172, Discretionary Disenfranchisement. Below it, she wrote, Observe passive, discriminatory conduct by cabin staff directed at high-visibility black passenger. Initial denial of pre-assigned seat, despite documented proof. Subsequent omission during meal service. Verbal disregard. Witness intervention prompted acknowledgement and delayed response. Follow-up required. Recommend full staff audit and internal bias training evaluation. She paused, then added one more line. Note presence of ally in seat 4D. Human decency remains an asset. When she finished, she closed the app and rested her hands in her lap. She stared ahead at nothing in particular, just the back of the seat in front of her, the stitching, the faint scratch on the plastic tray table, the kind of ordinary details that keep the world grounded. Then a voice. It was soft, hesitant. Excuse me. Doctor. Vaughn Celeste turned. Joanne stood there, a little uncertain but earnest. I didn't mean to embarrass you earlier. I couldn't not say something. Celeste offered a calm smile. You didn't embarrass me, she said. You reminded everyone else that I was here. Joanne exhaled, relieved. I used to teach in a district that looked the other way all the time. It wears on you. Celeste nodded. I know it does. I read about you once. Joanne said, you spoke at a university conference about ethics and aviation. Celeste raised an eyebrow. That talk was never uploaded. Joanne smiled. I was in the audience. That made Celeste pause. The world really was smaller than it pretended to be. Joanne offered a small nod and returned to her seat. Celeste leaned back again. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the sun began to dip outside, casting long rays across the clouds. The golden hour of the sky. She folded her hands, steady, certain now. This flight, this moment, this envelope, it was not coincidence. It was assignment. The plane cruised at a steady pace, engine hum like a lullaby, soft and repetitive. Cabin lights had dimmed to a muted amber, the kind that makes people speak in whispers, that encourages sleep but leaves space for quiet thought. Celeste Vaughn wasn't sleeping. Her tray table was lowered. Her tablet rested on it, screen glowing softly in the dimness. On the screen, a blank email. No subject line. No recipient. Just the blinking cursor, patiently waiting for words. She stared at it for a while. The kind of staring that was more about listening to what your heart is trying to say than actually thinking. Then, slowly, her fingers began to move. I do not know what will happen next. She paused, then kept going. I've spent years watching other people act like truth is optional, watching systems hide behind protocol, watching apologies come too late and reform arrive only after tragedy. I always said I would not become one of them. Today, I nearly did. She stopped again. The email had no addressee, but in her heart, she knew exactly who it was for. Her mother, who never had the chance to sit in first class, who cleaned hotel rooms for 32 years, who used to bring home the mini soaps and store them in a drawer like they were tiny, fragrant trophies. Her mother, who told her once, while folding a guest towel into a swan, that black women have to work twice as hard just to be forgotten half as quickly. Celeste blinked. Her throat tightened, but she continued, I was removed from my seat today. First class, boarding pass correct, behavior calm, papers clean, but I was still removed. No explanation, no apology. They just told me my seat wasn't available anymore and escorted me toward the back like I was part of the carpet. I said nothing at first, not because I didn't have words, but because I was so used to this happening in ways that were less obvious, less public, more polite. But today, I was reminded, polite does not mean just... Joanne spoke up, a woman I've never met. She asked a question, and the entire plane felt it. People turned, and in that moment, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time, witnessed. Her hand hovered over the screen. She didn't know what she was writing toward. But it didn't matter. She just needed to write. She scrolled down and kept going. I wonder if you would be proud of me. I used to think success meant not having to face this anymore. That the letters after my name and the titles on my desk would somehow shield me from these slights. That if I climbed high enough, I would stop being reminded of what I carry when I walk into a room. But you were right. They don't stop seeing what they want to see. Today reminded me that this work is not about being seen as the exception. It's about making sure the rules no longer expect our silence. Celeste stopped and looked out the window. Below them, somewhere between Missouri and New Mexico, cities turned into pinpricks of golden light. Highways looked like glowing veins. Life continued, unaware that a quiet reckoning was taking place on seat 3A. She tapped the screen again. I am no longer angry. I am responsible. Not because I asked to be, but because I carry what you gave me. A name, a spine, and a promise. She reread the words, then added one last line. You never had a seat in first class, but today I carried you there with me, and you are not going anywhere. She saved the email to drafts, then closed her eyes. For a long time, she didn't move. Not when the crew offered water, not when a child cried somewhere near the back, not even when the air shifted slightly from warm to cool. She was inside herself now, and for the first time in hours, she let herself feel it all. The embarrassment, the anger, the pride, the fear, the unbearable weight of needing to be more than one thing at the same time. Strong and soft, angry and kind, public and private, Dr. Vaughn and just Celeste. It was exhausting and beautiful. At some point, she felt the presence of someone beside her. Joanne again. I'm sorry, the woman said softly. I just wanted to check on you. Celeste opened her eyes slowly. I'm all right. Just thinking. Joanne hesitated. I hope I didn't overstep earlier. No, Celeste replied, her voice firm. You didn't. You gave something back to the room that was being taken. Joanne sat in the empty aisle seat beside her, careful not to intrude too closely. I teach middle school, she said. I see how early it starts. The quiet exclusions, the reshuffling, the blaming. Sometimes I wish I could shout for them, but all I can do is document and push policy from inside. Celeste nodded. That's what I do too. Joanne blinked. You're a teacher. Celeste smiled faintly. In a way, Just not in a classroom." There was a pause. Then Joanne said, "After what happened, they kept whispering. Some were filming. I saw a man tweet about it, but no one else stood." Celeste nodded again. People think witnessing is passive, but it isn't. It's participation. Joanne looked down, twisting her wedding ring slowly. "It shouldn't be this hard." Celeste's voice was quiet, but certain. "But it is." Then she stood. She reached into her bag and handed Joanne a card. It had no title, just a name and an encrypted email address. Joanne looked at it, then back up. "Is this you?" Celeste simply said. "When you report what they don't want to admit, use that." Joanne stared at her for a moment. "You're someone important, aren't you?" Celeste met her gaze. "Not yet, but I will be with that." She returned to her seat. As Joanne walked away, the plane hit a pocket of gentle turbulence, just enough to make people straighten their trays and glance out the windows, but Celeste barely noticed. She reached for her tablet again and opened her inbox. This time, she selected a recipient: to Internal Audit Equality Trust, Gov Subject Recommendation, for Onboard Incident Case Review, Flight 417. She began typing with precision. Full incident observed, including willful reassignment of purchased seating without explanation. Discrepancy in staff response time. Witness testimony from seated passengers confirms racial bias pattern in treatment. She attached a time-stamped flight recording from her seat's camera, a silent witness. The camera blinked green when recording. She hit send, no hesitation, just purpose. And as the email disappeared into the cloud, Celeste leaned back and looked at the cabin once more. People were relaxed again, laughing, sleeping, watching movies. None of them knew that the woman in seat 3A had just started the first step toward a formal airline inquiry. They would learn soon enough. And when they did, she wouldn't be asking for attention, only accountability. The wheels touched the tarmac with a soft bump, the kind that made your heart pause for half a beat before the rest of your body caught up. Passengers stirred, phones lit up, and overhead bins began to click as seat belts remained stubbornly fastened. Flight 417 had landed in Denver, but something in the air still hung suspended. Celeste Vaughn kept her seatbelt fastened, not out of defiance, but clarity. She needed a moment before standing, a moment to absorb the weight of everything that had happened above 30,000 feet. A flight attendant announced the arrival time, local temperature, and asked everyone to remain seated until the seatbelt sign was off. Celeste's hands rested on her lap, calm and folded, but her mind wasn't still. She thought about the email, the one she had sent mid-air. She thought about the staff who would read it, about the legal team that would now have to document what happened in seat 3A, about the names that would appear in internal files and closed-door meetings. And she thought about the little girl she used to be, the one who used to sit at the back of her mama's cleaning cart, pretending she was flying to places with real linen napkins and gold-plated seatbelts. That little girl was still in there, watching, waiting, witnessing it all. People were beginning to stand now. Voices filled the cabin, a blend of polite farewells and quiet urgency. The man across the aisle grabbed his bag without looking at her. The couple behind her whispered about dinner reservations. Joanne Lively gave her a soft nod and a quiet smile as she passed. No words, just understanding. Celeste remained seated, and then something unusual happened. The cockpit door opened. That almost never happened this early, not until the last passenger had stepped off. But there he was, the captain. He was older than she had expected, late 50s maybe, hair silver at the temples, a crisp uniform that suggested military roots. His presence was calm, but his eyes held something else, intention. He stepped into the aisle and paused beside her row. "Dr. Vaughn?" he asked. She looked up, startled but steady. "Yes." He extended his hand. "I wanted to meet you." She hesitated for just a second before accepting his handshake. His grip was firm, not performative, meant to say something without words. "I saw what happened," he said, voice low and sincere. "I'm sorry." Celeste tilted her head slightly. "You were flying." He nodded. "And watching. I've been in this job for 32 years. I've seen a lot. I don't speak up often because there's a chain of command. But what happened today was wrong, and I thought someone should say it, face to face." Celeste studied him for a moment. "You could have said it over the intercom." "I could have." He agreed. "But apologies are heavier in person, and you deserved that weight." People around them were watching now. A few passengers paused, unsure whether to listen or keep moving. But the captain didn't flinch. He waited, letting the moment exist without rushing it. Celeste nodded once. "Thank you. That means something." He took a breath, as though choosing his next words carefully. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 26, works in tech. She's the only black woman on her team. She tells me stories sometimes, about being asked if she's in the wrong meeting, about being talked over, ignored, called aggressive for speaking with clarity." Celeste's eyes softened. She understood that look in his face. It wasn't guilt. It was realization. "Her name?" she asked. "Danielle," he said. Celeste smiled faintly. "Tell Danielle her stories are not falling on deaf ears. And tell her she's not alone." He looked relieved, then proud, then thoughtful. As he turned to walk back toward the cockpit, he paused again. "If there's anything I can do," he said, "to support what you're about to do with that email, let me know." She raised an eyebrow slightly. He added, "I won't pretend I know the whole story, but I saw enough to know who had power and who didn't." Then he disappeared behind the door again. Passengers continued deplaning, but something in the energy of the cabin had shifted. People moved a little slower, a little more thoughtfully, as though the silence between overhead bins now held an echo of something heavier. Celeste finally rose. She grabbed her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. As she walked toward the exit, a young flight attendant, a different one from earlier, gave her a slight bow of the head. "I just want to say," she whispered, "some of us are watching and learning." Celeste didn't respond with words. She just placed a hand on the woman's forearm, gently, firmly, as if to say, "Keep going." The jet bridge was quiet. At the end of it, 2 men in suits stood near the exit, clearly not airline staff. They straightened as she approached. "Dr. Vaughn," one of them said, "we've been asked to escort you to a private car." Celeste paused. "Who asked?" He handed her a plain white envelope. She opened it. Inside, a single sentence typed on thick paper. "Your work has already started." She folded it slowly and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Tell them," she said, "I'm not here for favors." One of the men replied softly, "They know." She walked past them, down into the concourse, alone, but somehow no longer unseen. The Denver terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm. Suitcases rolled, children squealed, baristas shouted names into cups, and Celeste moved through it all with the quiet grace of someone who had stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. She stopped briefly at a large window, looking out over the runway. Another plane was lifting into the sky, its engines roaring toward altitude. She thought about the turbulence, not just in the air, but in people, in systems, in voices. And she knew something was coming. Something beyond a seat on a flight. This was never about just flying. This was about who gets to arrive with dignity and who gets quietly denied that landing. In a soundproof conference room on the 12th floor of Silver Line Air's corporate headquarters, the glow of 24 screens flickered against glass walls. The mood was quiet, but tense. Executives leaned forward, legal pads open, coffee cooling untouched in expensive ceramic mugs. Someone was typing furiously. Someone else was scrolling through social media, eyes widening at every refresh. And on the largest screen at the end of the table, her name appeared, Dr. Celeste Vaughn, passenger complaint logged, Flight 417. The digital report had been filed only 40 minutes earlier, but it was already on the radar of legal, ethics and compliance, media relations, and even the Office of Investor Trust. Not because the system worked perfectly, but because someone inside the loop had pushed it manually. A woman named Patrice Geller sat at the edge of the room, her badge clipped discreetly inside her cardigan. She was mid-level, not an executive, not a name most people recognized, but she was the one who had flagged the report to upper leadership. She had seen Celeste's name before, years ago, in an article about Black women leading innovation in supply chain logistics. She remembered reading the piece twice, not because of the industry, but because of how Celeste had described leadership. True power, Celeste had said, is the ability to create space where none existed before. That sentence had stayed with Patrice, and now Celeste was here, in her system, not as a keynote speaker, but as a complaint. A moment of silence hung over the room. Then a man with thinning gray hair and sharp gold cufflinks broke it. "Do we know exactly what happened yet?" He didn't look up from his tablet. "Not fully," said the woman from HR, "but we have an initial statement from Dr. Vaughn, corroborated in part by another passenger named Joanne Lively. And there's video." She turned to the screen and tapped twice. It played without sound. Footage from a teenager's phone, grainy, but clear enough. You could see the flight attendant, wide stance, arm outstretched. Celeste seated calmly. The conversation seemed low volume, but the body language was unmistakable. An escalation, a refusal to listen. Then came the moment where the agent from security leaned in and pointed to Celeste's seat. The room shifted. Executives crossed their arms. Legal frowned. She didn't raise her voice, the VP of Communications asked. "No," Patrice said quietly. "Not once." She was asked to move without cause. Ask someone else. Correct. The seat was hers. First class. Ticket verified. She had pre-boarding privileges as part of our Global Equity Leadership Partner Program. A younger man, freshly promoted, made the mistake of chuckling. Ironic. Huh. Equity leadership, and then this. No one laughed. Patrice locked eyes with him, not in anger, but in quiet clarity. "I don't think she finds it ironic," she said. "I think she finds it predictable." The room went still again. On the screen, the video continued. It showed Celeste turning her head slightly toward the passenger beside her, then back to the flight attendant, then stillness, a silence that spoke louder than any protest. "She's not threatening legal action yet," someone noted from the compliance side, "but we anticipate media pressure. The report includes terms like implicit bias, racial profiling, and public humiliation." The VP of PR looked down at her phone, then back up. "We're too late." She turned the screen toward the others. Celeste's name was now trending on 3 platforms, not because she had said anything online, but because the teenager who recorded the clip had posted it with a simple caption. "She paid for her seat." So why was security called That Was All It Took? Thousands of retweets. Dozens of small accounts asking if it was racial bias. And one reply from a verified voice in black venture capital: I hope Silverline Air is ready to lose more than just altitude. Back at the airport, Celeste stood alone in a quiet arrivals corridor, waiting for the town car that had been arranged. She had declined the press, politely, firmly. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about control. And she knew that control required silence first. Silence to think, to organize the memory into narrative, to separate emotion from response. The car pulled up, black and understated. The driver, an older woman with silver braids tucked under a cap, stepped out and opened the door for her. Dr. Vaughn, she said. Celeste nodded. Whereto Celeste took a breath. The Marlowe Hotel, and then to the rooftop. The woman smiled. You got it. As the car moved through downtown Denver, Celeste stared out the window. She didn't pull out her phone. She didn't scroll. She thought about her mother, who used to braid her hair and whisper stories about invisible power, about the uncle who used to tell her that flying was a rich man's game, about the first time she ever saw the inside of a private terminal and wondered what the people who built it thought of someone like her walking through its gates. And she thought about control, not of others, but of the story, her story. When they arrived at the Marlowe, she walked straight past the check-in desk and into the elevator. The rooftop access required a key. She had one. It had arrived at her office months ago with a note. You built the supply chain. You can break it too. No signature. But she knew where it had come from. The elevator opened to the rooftop lounge. It was empty, save for a man in a charcoal coat standing near the edge, sipping water from a low glass tumbler. Celeste, he said as she approached. Malcolm, she replied. He gestured toward the skyline. I figured you'd want the city, not the boardroom. I want both, she said, but the city first. He handed her a folder. Inside were 2 printouts. One was a copy of Silverline Air's equity pledge, which included her signature from a year ago. The second was a chart, revenue, and projected losses if she pulled her company's logistics contracts from Silverline. $5 billion over 8 years. No lawsuits needed, just paperwork. Celeste stared at it. Malcolm waited. Then, softly, he asked, Do you want to burn the house down? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward the railing, wind lifting her hair slightly. The city below pulsed with light and noise. Unaware. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, her voice was steady. I don't want flames. I want the blueprint. The lights in the executive suite of Silverline Air never went dark that night. Past midnight, the 26th floor glowed like a lone ship in an ocean of glass towers, silent above a city that had already gone to sleep. Inside the war room, chairs scraped against polished floors and the low hum of air conditioning mixed with the anxious tapping of fingers on touchscreens. No one spoke loudly. No one dared, because the CEO had called an emergency meeting at 12:04 m, and no one declined. Gerald Markham, a man with a reputation for precision and a temper sharpened by 2 decades in aerospace finance, stood at the head of the table in tailored silence. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his watch was off, and his eyes were bloodshot from reading every single post attached to Celeste Vaughn's name. He didn't want to be here, not at this hour, not for a story he hadn't authorized, but stories had power. And this one had teeth. The room held 12 people. Only 3 of them were women. Only 1 was black. Her name was Dr. Simone Keats, head of ethics and equity policy, and she sat with her arms crossed tightly, expression unreadable. Gerald clicked his remote. A new projection filled the screen. Revenue losses by Q3. Shareholder sentiment drop. Brand erosion curves. The slope wasn't steep, but the trajectory was unmistakable. "This is not just about one flight," he began. Voice calm but clipped. "This is about visibility. This is about narrative control. This is about how one incident becomes the entire company's identity." Silence. He let the weight of it settle. She hasn't posted anything herself. Added the VP of risk. Not publicly. Not even a statement to the press. "That's what makes this dangerous," Simone said flatly. Eyes turned toward her. "Doctor, Vaughn doesn't need to say a word. She's already said enough by not speaking. The internet is writing the story for her. And people believe it because it aligns with their lived experience." Gerald didn't like that answer. He turned back to the screen. "What do we know about her next move?" Simone leaned forward. "She's in Denver." She checked into the Marlowe under her own name. She met with Malcolm Rhodes, her logistics strategist, 3 hours ago on the rooftop. "So she's planning a move," Gerald pressed. "She's already made it." Simone replied. He paused. "What do you mean?" "She filed a reassessment clause at 1013P, Mem. Tonight through the Infrastructure Equity Alliance. She's triggering the procurement review for all transport contracts between Vaughn Ventures and Silver Line. That's $5 billion over 8 years. If we lose that, others will follow." The clause was drafted by her general counsel 6 months ago. She wrote the terms herself. The silence was heavier this time. Someone on the other end of the table cursed softly into their palm. "She's a step ahead of us," Simone continued. "And not just legally, strategically. She's not coming for revenge. She's building leverage." Gerald sat down, slow and deliberate. He ran a hand over his mouth. "So what's our play?" Simone looked him in the eye. "We stop thinking of this as PR damage, and we start thinking of this as structural failure." He blinked. "I need solutions." She nodded. "You want one?" "Yes." "Step down." The room held its breath. Gerald stared at her, eyes narrowing. "That's not a solution." "It is," she replied, voice unshaken. "It won't solve everything. But it signals to stakeholders and the public that we're not protecting a hierarchy that failed to protect passengers. I didn't make the call to remove her from that seat. But your system did. And it worked exactly as designed. That's the problem. Her words didn't rise. They didn't pierce. They landed like soft weight, undeniable and inescapable." Gerald exhaled slowly. "She's not even asking for an apology." "No," Simone said. "She doesn't need one. At the Marlowe." Celeste stood barefoot in her hotel suite, looking out across the skyline. She hadn't slept, not even tried. Her bag was open on the chaise lounge, its contents half-packed, as if she might leave at any moment or stay for a week. She held a glass of water in one hand. In the other, her phone buzzed. A message. From her assistant back in Chicago. All 3 contracts marked for review. Press calls flooding in. CNBC wants you at noon. Also, your mother saw the video. She's proud. She said, "That's my daughter. Quiet, but fire." Celeste smiled gently. Quiet, but fire. It was true. She didn't want destruction. She wanted clarity. She wanted dignity made tangible. She wanted accountability that wasn't a spectacle, but a standard. Another message buzzed in. This one from Malcolm. Gerald called a midnight summit. They know now. But they're still thinking in headlines, not in systems. You have time. Time was exactly what she needed. Not for retribution, for design. In a world obsessed with speed, Celeste understood architecture. She knew that the strongest structures weren't built in noise. They were framed in silence and reinforced with intentionality. And so she drafted, on paper, in pencil, a flow chart of possibilities. One line led to federal inquiry, one to a public address before the Equity Alliance, one to a full divestment from Silverline and a migration of all Vaughn Ventures transport contracts to locally owned carriers with ethical alignment. And one line, the final line, led to a quiet conversation with Gerald Markham, not televised, not recorded, but transformative, a line that ended not in scandal, but in rebuild. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a name she hadn't seen in years. Ava Blake, investigative journalist, subject coffee. She clicked open the body of the email. Celeste. I saw what happened. Or rather, I saw what didn't happen. The restraint, the silence, the wait. I'd love to talk, not to publish, to understand, because what you're doing isn't just a protest. It's a model, and people need to see it, not just read about it. No pressure, just coffee, my treat. Celeste stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she opened a new note on her tablet. At the top, she wrote 2 words, Power Redefined. The building was made of steel and glass, like most places designed to intimidate. But Celeste Vaughn had long since learned not to flinch at architecture. She walked into the International Air Transport Equity Council's conference room wearing a muted gray suit and a soft navy blouse. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, not in arrogance, but in rhythm. She carried no entourage, just a legal pad in one hand and a leather folder in the other. Everyone in the room noticed her entrance. Some tried not to. Others tried too hard. Celeste scanned the seating chart as she approached the large table. It was U-shaped, with placards that denoted status by position. Years ago, when she first attended these sessions, she had been given a spot in the second ring, technically inside the room, but far from the decision-making core. They called it observer status. She had called it what it was, tolerated silence. But this time her name was at the head of the table. Front and center, a name in serif font, Dr. Celeste Vaughn, CEO, Vaughn Ventures, member, Infrastructure Equity Alliance, principal contracting partner for Federal Transit Modernization Initiative. She sat down slowly, not to savor it, to honor it. 3 seats to her left. The airline industry's legal counsel shifted in his chair. A man named Trevor Denton, Harvard-trained, fast-talking, nervous eyes. His firm represented both Silverline and its primary competitor. He adjusted his tie, but said nothing. Across from her was Dr. Leanne Corrigan, an Australian executive who ran an indigenous-owned air freight network across Oceania. Leanne offered a small, respectful nod. The chairwoman entered moments later. Meeting commenced at 10:03 a.m. The chairwoman's voice was steady as she opened with an acknowledgement of current tensions and the gravity of the moment. She then looked to Celeste. You asked for the floor. Celeste stood. No slides, no theatrics, just breath. I appreciate the space, she began. But I'm not here to speak about an incident. I'm here to speak about the system that permitted it, protected it, and prolonged it. The room was quiet. She continued. When I was removed from my seat on Flight 2876, I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even surprised. I was prepared, because I've seen this mechanism before. It's not always about volume or shouting. Often, discrimination whispers. It hides in phrasing, in assumptions, in procedural camouflage. A few people shifted. Celeste kept going. This is not only about race, this is about default settings, about which bodies get questioned, which voices are deferred, which passengers are presumed trustworthy without verification. She paused. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. I am not asking for sympathy. I am not threatening consequences. I am requesting clarity, accountability, and the redesign of our industry's operational assumptions. She opened her folder and handed out 2 documents, a white paper titled Equity as Infrastructure, and a policy framework titled Passenger Presumption Protocols. These documents outline a 5-step revision plan to address systemic inequity in boarding procedures, staff training, incident reporting, and accountability matrices. It is not exhaustive, but it is executable. Trevor finally spoke. We understand your concern, Dr. Vaughn. But is it not true that the incident on Flight 2876 resulted from a mistaken seat reallocation? There was a last-minute change, and the ground staff acted on what they believed was protocol. Celeste met his gaze gently. I do not dispute the confusion. I dispute the consistency of that confusion. Because this didn't happen to a white male CEO. It happened to me. And it wasn't the first time. He started to respond, but the chairwoman raised her hand. This is not a trial, she said firmly. It's a turning point. Celeste nodded in quiet agreement. She turned toward the room again. Equity is not reactive. It is proactive, and it is measurable. We cannot transform this industry with apologies. We must build standards that outlast us. Leanne Corrigan leaned forward. I've read your proposal. It's rigorous, and frankly, it's overdue. My company implements 3 of your 5 recommendations already. The results speak for themselves. Fewer complaints, higher customer retention, lower attrition among crew. You don't need to convince me. Celeste's eyes softened. Trevor cleared his throat again. The implementation cost would be considerable, and given the state of post-pandemic recovery, such investments could destabilize smaller carriers. Celeste didn't interrupt. When he finished, she answered calmly. The cost of injustice is always invisible at first, until it isn't, until it costs you $5 billion in divestment, until you lose public trust, until your shareholders ask why diversity audits were skipped for 3 quarters. She let the words rest. I'm not here to bleed the industry. I'm here to bind it differently, stronger, fairer, and yes, more human. Later that evening, Celeste sat alone in a small cafe 2 blocks from the council hall. It was quiet, lit with amber glass lights and the scent of chamomile. She stirred honey into her tea, but didn't drink it. Her mind was still full, not anxious, but wide awake. Her father used to say, if you want to rebuild something broken, you start at the frame. Don't patch the walls. Reinforce the foundation. She felt like that's what she was doing now. Not taking down the house, but rebuilding the frame. Her phone lit up. A message from Simone Keats. He's stepping down. Gerald announced it this afternoon. Interim CEO being appointed tomorrow. The board cited moral imperative and leadership renewal. Celeste read it twice. Then she closed her eyes, not in satisfaction, in stillness, because change was not a banner. It was a practice. Another message buzzed in. This one from Malcolm. 3 regional carriers just asked for your policy framework. Word spreading. You've started something. She opened her laptop and began drafting responses. Not press releases, implementation letters, resource sharing agreements, pilot program outlines. Because once the first crack in the dam had formed, she knew she had to guide the flood. But amid the planning, amid the paperwork, she let herself pause. She looked out the cafe window into the Denver twilight, and she remembered how it felt to be 16, sitting at the back of a coach seat, watching as the flight attendant handed blankets only to the row ahead. How it felt at 23 when her boarding pass was triple-checked while her white colleague breezed through. How it felt at 37 to be escorted off a plane by security without one question asked, and how it felt now to sit at the head of the table they once said she wasn't ready for, not because she demanded a seat, because she redesigned the table. Celeste Vaughn had never been one to keep a journal. She preferred movement over reflection, action over monologue. But late one night, a week after the hearing, with Denver cloaked in snow and silence, she opened her laptop and began typing not for the public, not for the board, not even for the media, but for herself. She did not know why she wrote it, only that she needed to. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then fell into rhythm. Dear Passenger 12C, you were there that day. You saw it happen. You watched as I was removed from my seat. You looked away when they asked me to stand. I do not blame you. You were trying to disappear, as most of us do when things get uncomfortable. You clutched your headphones, stared out the window, and waited for it to be over. But I wonder now, did you know who I was? Not by title, not by reputation, but by the truth of my presence. Did you see the calm in my face, the weight I carried in silence, the history stitched into my very breath? I am writing to tell you, I do not hate you, but I hope you remember. I hope the next time you witness someone being reduced, you do not fold into the shadows. I hope you stay visible, because we need each other to change this sky. She stared at the screen. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from something older, something deeper, exhaustion maybe, or grief. She closed the document, not saving it, but the next morning, it was still there. Her laptop had auto-saved the draft. She reread it over coffee. Her assistant Simone glanced over her shoulder. You should post that, Simone said quietly. Celeste shook her head. It's raw. Exactly, Simone said. We've heard the polished version. This is your heartbeat? Celeste didn't answer, but later that afternoon, while waiting at the airport lounge for a flight to Washington, she posted the letter anonymously on her company's internal forum under the subject line, Letter to 12C. She thought nothing would come of it. But within 24 hours, the letter had been screenshotted, reshared, reposted, and translated into 9 languages. By the end of the week, it had 2.8 million shares, and by Monday morning, it was printed on the front page of The Atlantic. A legislative aide named Riley Jansen sat at his desk in D.C., scrolling through Twitter when the letter landed in his feed. He paused, then clicked. He read it once, then again. Then he emailed it to Senator Elias Monroe. Subject, you need to read this now. Monroe called him within 10 minutes. Is it verified? It came from Vaughn Ventures IP. Looks authentic. Even if it wasn't, the impact is real. Draft me something. That night, the Senate Ethics Committee received a proposal titled The Visible Passenger Act. The act, co-sponsored by a bipartisan panel, outlined the following: 1. Mandatory bias training and certification for all commercial flight attendants, renewed annually. 2. Third-party incident review panels for all passenger complaints involving seating or security removal. 3. Creation of an anonymous in-flight witness reporting system called SkyStand. 4. Public transparency reports released quarterly by all commercial carriers, detailing racial and demographic data on all in-flight disputes. 5. A national audit and policy alignment enforced by the Department of Transportation within 18 months of ratification. It was the most sweeping federal airline legislation since the post-9/11 security reform. And it had all started with a letter to a stranger. Celeste was not prepared for what happened next. She never asked for the letter to be published. She never sought the spotlight, but somehow it had become a beacon for others. People began sharing their own stories, tagging them with them wearing her 12C. A black mother from Seattle posted about being told her toddler was too loud for business class. A Sikh man from New Jersey shared how he was removed from a flight for refusing to remove his turban. An elderly Latina grandmother posted a photo of her being told to prove her U.S. citizenship before boarding. Each story was heartbreakingly familiar. Each one lit another match. Soon the stories were too many to ignore. CNN hosted a panel titled Who Gets to Fly in Peace? NBC aired a special report called The Seat You Never Had. Even the FAA issued a public statement acknowledging the systemic disparities faced by passengers of color. But not everyone was pleased. A popular conservative radio host called Celeste, an opportunist playing the race card for clout. A viral YouTuber tried to discredit her letter as strategic, emotional manipulation. Celeste did not respond, not with words. She responded with structure. She hired 24 regional coordinators across the country to implement training and visibility initiatives. She partnered with a trauma recovery organization to provide legal and mental health support to those impacted by discriminatory travel experiences. She established a national hotline called Clear Sky for in-flight injustice reports. And she continued to write, not letters, policy, blueprints, hope. One morning, she received a package, no sender name, just a return address from Kentucky. Inside was a handwritten note on lined paper. Dear Dr. Vaughn, I was 12C. I read your letter. I cried. And then I told my daughter about you. I wish I had spoken up that day. I truly do. But I didn't know how. I didn't think my voice mattered. It does now. Thank you. I carry you with me. Celeste pressed the note to her chest and sat in silence for a long time. Then she placed the note beside her father's framed photo on her bookshelf. A quiet acknowledgement of lineage, a full circle moment, not of completion, but continuation. At a conference months later, Celeste spoke to a crowd of over 3,000 airline staff from around the world. She stood beneath the soft glow of auditorium lights, holding the stage without effort. This began with pain, she said, but it became policy. This began with silence, but it became song. I did not set out to be a voice. I just refused to remain an echo. And when she stepped off that stage, the crowd stood. Not for her name, but for her presence, for her truth, for the flight she never let crash. The call came from the airline's executive office. It wasn't surprising. Not after the public firestorm, the congressional hearing, and the quiet but seismic drop in ticket sales from black and brown communities across the country. Celeste Vaughn sat quietly in her Denver office, the snow melting outside her window. As her assistant Simone placed the phone on speaker, Dr. Vaughn, came the voice on the other end. Thank you for taking the call. Celeste didn't respond at first. She sipped her tea, waiting. The man continued, I'm Gregory Sinclair, interim CEO at Crestway Air. I understand that a number of regrettable incidents occurred under my predecessor. We are reaching out to personally offer our sincerest apologies. And we'd like to begin the process of Celeste cut in, her voice calm but unyielding. You're not calling to apologize. You're calling because your board is terrified. You're calling because your revenue projections dropped 9% this quarter. You're calling because, for the first time in your company's history, you're facing coordinated legal action, political oversight, and community boycott all at once. Silence. Dr. Vaughn. Sinclair began again, more measured now. I'm hoping to make things right. We'd like to invite you to a private meeting with our diversity task force. A conversation. A fresh start. Celeste stood up and walked to the window. She could see the mountains in the distance, clear and sharp against the sky. "No," she said softly. "We're beyond conversations. You can send a formal statement of accountability to the public. You can support the Visible Passenger Act. You can fund independent bias audits for all domestic carriers. But you don't get a photo op with me. Not now. Not ever." Sinclair was silent for several beats. Then he offered one last olive branch. "Would you at least consider appearing on a panel with us at the upcoming Aviation Equity Summit?" Celeste exhaled slowly. "I'll appear," she said, "but not to shake hands. I'll be there to speak, and I'll say exactly what needs to be said, with or without your blessing." Then she ended the call. Simone looked up from her tablet. "That's the second airline this week." Celeste nodded. "They think we want an apology, but what we want is protection, dignity, enforcement." She returned to her desk and opened a file labeled Restoration Blueprint. Inside were dozens of pages of proposals, audit pathways, community insights, and training protocols. Not just words. Systems. Real change. The day of the Aviation Equity Summit arrived under heavy media coverage. It was held in Atlanta, in a downtown hotel that had hosted civil rights leaders 6 decades prior. The room was filled with airline executives, civil servants, equity consultants, and journalists. Celeste arrived alone. No entourage, no makeup artist, just a navy suit, a small notebook, and her father's silver watch on her wrist. When she entered the room, the energy shifted, not from fear, from recognition. Not everyone applauded, but everyone watched. The panel began. A moderator introduced the speakers. Gregory Sinclair was seated 2 chairs down from Celeste. He gave her a polite nod, but she did not return it. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly. "I am not here to make this comfortable," she began. "I am here to make it clear." The room quieted. I was told to leave my seat. I was escorted like a criminal. I was erased with a smile. And when the airline tried to apologize, it wasn't to heal. It was to protect itself. Let me say this plainly, an apology means nothing without restructuring. She opened her notebook and read a list. 211 verified passenger removals over the last 3 years, where race or gender played a factor. 117 complaints dismissed without review. 56 employees reassigned instead of terminated. And one major airline, this airline, whose internal policies still allow cabin leaders to override seating assignments at will, without accountability. She paused, looked at Sinclair. "Your apology is not accepted, because it was never really offered." The audience was quiet. Then someone in the back stood and clapped. Then another, and another. By the time Celeste returned to her seat, the room was on its feet. That evening, as Celeste left the summit hall, a young black woman approached her outside the hotel. She wore a badge from a small regional carrier. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said shyly, "but I just wanted to thank you." Celeste smiled. "You're not bothering me. I'm a flight attendant," the woman explained. "Second year. I almost quit last year, after a passenger cursed me out for no reason and no one defended me. My supervisor said to just ignore it, pretend it didn't happen. But after your story came out, our airline started making changes. Small ones, but real." Celeste placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "Keep going," she said. "You belong in that sky." The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "Your name's?" Celeste asked. "Jasmine," she replied. "Jasmine Holt." "I'll remember that," Celeste said. "And one day, they will too." Later that night, alone in her hotel room, Celeste sat by the window and thought about her father. He had once told her that dignity was not about what others gave you. It was about what you refused to let them take. She reached for the old watch on her wrist, feeling its steady weight. Outside, a plane took off into the night sky, and Celeste knew this wasn't just about one flight, one seat, or one woman. It was about every silent moment endured, every unjust policy allowed to remain. Every time someone looked away, it was about making the air safe not just for bodies, but for truth. And she was not done. Not yet. It started with a letter, not a press release or a tweet, not a live interview or trending hashtag, just a letter, printed on thick ivory paper and signed in dark blue ink by the chairwoman of the Senate Transportation Committee. Celeste held it in her hands, reading it 3 times before setting it down on her kitchen table. She didn't smile, not at first. Her expression was something quieter, something more sacred. The letter confirmed the passage of the Visible Passenger Act, federal law. No passenger could be removed from a flight without immediate documentation, escalation review, and supervisor override on record and retrievable by public request. Implicit bias training would be required not only for airline staff but also for the companies contracted to enforce security. And any passenger who experienced discrimination during air travel now had a federally protected channel for recourse and restitution. It was everything she had pushed for, everything she'd fought for after that flight, after that humiliation, after that moment when the world finally saw what so many had quietly endured. Celeste reached for her tea and looked out her window. Morning light filtered through the Denver skyline, and in the distance, a plane ascended smoothly into the clouds. Then she allowed herself to smile, not because she'd won, but because everyone else finally had a chance. 2 months later, she stood in front of a crowd at Howard University. The air in the auditorium was electric. Rows of students, faculty, airline workers, and activists packed the room. Some held up phones. Others wore T-shirts with her image strong, poised, seated in 3A. She almost laughed when she saw them. She had never wanted to be a symbol, but perhaps symbols were sometimes necessary. She stepped to the podium and paused as the applause faded. "I didn't plan to become a name on your timelines," she began, "or a face in your documentaries. I didn't intend to hold press conferences or testify under oath. I was simply trying to get to New York." Soft laughter swept through the room. But here's the thing about injustice. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't ask if you're tired or afraid or quietly healing from your own private wars. It arrives, and when it does, you have a choice: to let it pass or to stop it cold. She looked around the auditorium. "You all know what I chose." A wave of applause surged again. "I was escorted off that flight because someone didn't think I belonged. But I do. I belong in that seat, in that boardroom, in this room. And so do you." Celeste's voice deepened, the warmth of her conviction drawing every listener closer. We cannot simply ask for fairness. We must engineer it, protect it, enforce it. And when we are removed, when we are dismissed, we do not disappear. We rise, and we return. Not for vengeance, but for truth. She stepped back from the podium, the room now standing. A sea of hands clapped. Some cried. Some simply stood still, watching her like they were witnessing history. Because they were. In the weeks that followed, Celeste returned to her work at the Vaughn Institute. But things had changed. More people reached out. More companies asked for her voice in their strategies. More parents emailed her, thanking her for being visible. She read every email. One night, she found a message from a woman named Elena Cooper. She was the mother of a 10-year-old boy who had seen the video of Celeste being removed from the plane. He had cried when he saw it, He asked why someone would do that to a lady who did nothing wrong. Celeste replied personally. She told the boy that sometimes people make decisions out of fear, and that fear can look like power. But real power, she said, comes from knowing who you are and staying gentle anyway. That email exchange went viral. It was shared across parenting forums, educator newsletters, and eventually national TV. But what mattered most to Celeste was the final line the boy had written back. He said, "One day I want to build planes and make sure no one gets taken off unless they did something bad for real." Celeste printed his message and pinned it to her corkboard. It reminded her why she did any of it. Months later, she received an invitation, this time from Crestway Air. It wasn't from their CEO. It was from a group of employees, pilots, gate agents, flight attendants who had started a grassroots initiative within the company called Skybound Justice. They had rewritten their training programs, built their own reporting structure, advocated for an independent ombudsman system. They wanted Celeste to see what they had done. No media, no fanfare, just a tour. She hesitated at first. The name alone brought back too many memories. But then she remembered Jasmine Holt and all the other young people like her. Maybe it was time. She flew coach. When she stepped onto the plane, she felt a flutter in her chest. Familiar, unsettling. But as she walked down the aisle, she saw something new. On each seat back was a laminated passenger rights card. On the uniforms of the staff were small pins with the Skybound Justice logo, 2 wings forming a heart. As she took her seat near the window, a young flight attendant approached. "Dr. Vaughn," he said quietly, offering her a bottle of water. "We're honored." She looked at him, then out the window at the tarmac. "No," she replied. "I'm just watching the work continue." And when the plane lifted into the sky, she didn't close her eyes. She stayed present. Every second of that flight, every voice she now carried with her. Because the seat wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to move, to wait, to shrink. She hadn't just reclaimed her seat. She had rewritten the skies. For all of us. She didn't yell. She didn't fight back with fists. She simply stood, then spoke. And when she did, the world finally listened. Celeste Vaughn's journey is more than just a viral clip or a courtroom headline. It is a mirror reflecting what too many still endure quietly: dismissal, humiliation, the belief that they do not belong. But what if every time someone is told to move, they rise instead? What if we stopped asking for permission and started rewriting the system? Because of Celeste. Airline policy changed. Because of her, no one can be removed from a seat without cause again. And because of her, dignity now has documentation. This story may end here, but the conversation must continue. Discrimination doesn't need to scream to cause damage. Sometimes, it looks like a polite smile, followed by a request to leave. Let's remember this. No seat is truly ours until it is everyone's. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or made you think, please like, share, and subscribe. Your voice matters. And together, we'll keep telling stories that don't just go viral. They make change. See you in the next one.